Good afternoon. Welcome to Lens on the World. My name is Ralph Winnie. I'm here with my colleague Josiah Henson. We are law partners in the Washington, D.C. office of the premier international law firm of IPO Pang Xingpu Law. And we're here to address the state of U.S.-China relations vis-a-vis Iran and North Korea in light of President Trump's recent address to the United Nations. Josh, what do you think of Trump's remarks at the UN and his position in general towards China? It's taken a very different stance, I think, from the previous administration. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. when it comes to Trump and his foreign policy, particularly with China, is who knows. Trump has made inconsistent statements in the eyes of some, from his campaign promises where he promised to crack down on various things in China. Just recently in August, for example, there has been a crackdown on intellectual property issues, and that's been followed by some sanctions imposed on various Chinese and Russian companies. On the other hand, there was a great meeting at Mar-a-Lago, and I think the Chinese, to some extent, are confused, as we all are, but the Chinese in their foreign policy tend to be less ideological than their predecessors, and Trump is less ideological than his predecessor. So what we have now is a situation where Trump is coming on to them and saying, what can you do for me? And they're not sure exactly how to respond. They obviously are not sure they completely trust Trump, but I think the relationship has the potential of being substantially better than what we had with Barack Obama, if only because Trump is a businessman and has a very business-oriented approach. He's less ideological, and everything he's done to date, I think, if you look at it through a businessman's eyes, makes much more sense than if you look at it through, say, a diplomat's eyes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very interesting point, because many Americans have been trying to rationalize Trump's behavior, and they cannot understand why he doesn't speak more like a diplomat. And people have to understand he's not a diplomat. He's a businessman. He's a deal maker. That's what he ran on. And it's very easy as a businessman and a deal maker to move from one position to another, but at the same time bring everybody to the table to have concrete discussions. And I think this is going to be key moving forward as to how we can engage on the transactional side with the Chinese government. I think that's very, very important moving forward.
Exactly. I think if you look for Trump's statements and look at what he's talking, what he's doing, you'll see inconsistencies. If you think of him as a negotiator who's changing his positions to match the needs of the particular moment, I think he's much more understandable. And right now, what is it that he wants? Well, right now, I think he needs good relations with China. China's become a leading trade partner with the United States. We are obviously their biggest trade partners. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, China had no hesitation about jumping right in and helping their partners. In fact, I think Mao Zedong said China and Korea were as close as lips and teeth. Yeah. I don't think they'd say that anymore. On the contrary, I think that they are a little less skeptical of the U.S. today than I think they might have been. They're certainly more skeptical of the Koreans now. And one of the statements I heard that I found really interesting is, if you look at China's policy right now towards the Korean situation, which is in the forefront of everybody's mind given the current diplomatic situation, you can kind of summarize it in three things. It's no war, no chaos, no nukes. And that's what they're going for. I think there's a lot of discussion about the Korean situation in China, and I think the direction in which they're going is to say, if Korea attacks the United States, they may well stay neutral. If the United States attacks Korea, they may be obligated to support them. They had a mutual protection agreement back in 1961, which renews every 20 years. I think it's 2021 is the next time it's up for renewal. But on the other hand, a lot of the Chinese military are saying that his nuclear proliferation has violated the treaty and they're no longer obligated. So the question at one extreme is, what do we do if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula? Not sure. The bottom line is that anything that changes the stability of the region, the Chinese are going to be very concerned about.
And I think you see a lot of young people in China, they're very upset with the North Korean government because they don't understand why their own government has to support them and in effect bail them out when they could lead a more prosperous life. Because you ask any young person in China, they want to be an entrepreneur, they want to travel, they want to work and make money, and they don't understand this radical Marxist-Leninist mindset of the North Korean government that is really pushing for confrontation. At the same time, they don't want the U.S. to engage North Korea in a way that would destabilize the peninsula. So you've got these two competing ideologies, I think, that are going back and forth. And it'll be very interesting, I think, to see how the Chinese government is going to react as Trump moves forward, in making sure that the North Koreans realize that they cannot have nuclear weapons.
Well, if you look at this from a social point of view, China leads the rest of the world in terms of the number of foreign students they have in this country. There are literally thousands of Chinese going back every year who become acquainted with the United States, who realizes that we're not really the great adversary that we once seemed to be. By contrast, they look at North Korea with compassion, with something that, according to some, approaches pity for the fact that Korea isn't a state where China was years ago.
Oh, sure.
It's undeveloped, and they can relate much more easily to the United States, particularly with the advent of the internet, where the North Koreans and the Chinese see the rest of the world. I think there may be a lot of Chinese who feel closer to the United States than feel closer to Korea at this point.
And you don't have Chinese going overseas to North Korea as part of delegations like you did, even 20, 30 years ago. So they've lost that connection with the North, per se. And it will be very interesting as to what this next generation in China is going to do, what kind of pressure they put on the government to slowly divorce themselves from what they consider a rogue country. At the same time, China is one of North Korea's largest trading partners, and in order to keep the country stable, China has to continue to trade and engage with them. And at what point is the Chinese government going to tell the North Koreans, you're on your own if you don't stop threatening the West, because we are going to not support you at this point? China doesn't want to have to be put in that position. At the same time, they don't want a very chaotic situation on the Korean Peninsula that would disrupt trade and economic relations.
Well, the economic relations, I think, are critical when you think about it. Some huge percentage, it used to be up to 90% of all the energy resources that Korea needed came from China. If China were to cut off the coal, which they've done periodically, it could virtually cripple the Koreans. But keep in mind, China shares an 880-mile border with Korea. That's important. More important, however, is China is sort of a buffer state between Korea is a buffer state between China and the rest of the world, and the presence of a friendly state there is going to be critical. What happens if South Korea, which is avowedly pro-U.S., were to take over? Right. Well, on the one hand, the cost of reunification would be some $3 trillion, and that would have an impact on the trade with China. More importantly, there would probably be, it's estimated, up to 30 million refugees go to China, and that's something I think the Chinese don't want. So again, it comes back to the 3 points. No war, no chaos, no nukes. Right. And the latter one, the no nukes, is really on everyone's mind today. The proliferation that seems to be possible has got a lot of Chinese worried.
Right. Well, and I think Trump has made it clear that North Korea cannot have a nuclear weapons program. At the same time, the North Korean government believes that in order to achieve international respectability, prestige, is to have a nuclear weapons program. They've looked at Libya and they've looked at other countries that have given up their nuclear weapons, and the regime has fallen. So the North Korean government believes the key to their survival is having a viable nuclear weapons program. At the same time, Trump is trying to instill in their mind that they will be destroyed if they continue on this reckless course of having nuclear weapons. Now, whether China believes Trump will be very interesting, and what additional leverage they have with North Korea. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next few weeks. But I do think the Chinese recognize how important this situation is, and they are going to continue to ratchet up the control.
Well, keep in mind, since the Korean War in the 50s, China's become a major trading partner with the United States. Secondly, the perception of North Korea is no longer that of brother in arms, which is the way the Chinese used to basically view the Koreans. In fact, I would say that there's many in China that now view their relationship with Korea as more of a liability than a positive, positive aspect. So where we go from here is not exactly clear. The real question is, I think, what is Trump going to do? Because that really determines everything else. The Chinese will react to Trump, and they've been trying to sort of downplay the difficult situation with Trump. A lot of people hear, well, we're unhappy with the nuclear proliferation, and suddenly they think, well, man, China's on our side now. But the situation is more complicated than that. The nuclear proliferation has made them very much nervous, made the Chinese nervous. But how they react to that, again, has to do with what Trump will do. We have seen the Chinese putting some pressure on the Korean recently, and the Trump administration has been very, very hard on the Chinese to do that. However, they're probably not going to go as far as the Trump administration would like them to do. And the Trump administration has some limits to how far he can go too.
So there could be an issue of rearming Japan, pushing a stronger alliance between South Korea and Japan as a way to send a direct message to the North Korean regime. Thank you. We'll be right back.
How can I help my daughter with her reading?
Searching for help with Dachshund Reading.
How can I help my daughter with her reading?
Information on hot water heating.
No. Sarah's bright, but when she's reading, she has trouble sounding out the words.
World music, playing track now.
No.
Let me try. Our daughter gets confused about which details in a story are important.
Which paper towels are most absorbent?
What?
Here are 5 product reviews.
Why are you not getting me?
See, I told you.
Wait, I was trying to show you how Sarah feels every day. Frustrating, isn't it? Redirecting to Understood.org.
For the 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues, this is what life can feel like. Explore Understood.org, a free online resource about learning and attention issues, designed to help your child thrive in school and in life. Understood.org, because understanding is everything.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. Already posted it.
Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm Ralph Winnie Jr. here with Josh Henson. As we discussed in the previous segment, certainly the situation with North Korea has been very problematic, and things will change rapidly within the next few weeks. So we will definitely keep an eye on these ever-increasing new developments. So I'd like to pivot and talk about U.S. situation with Iran. That was another focal point of Donald Trump's speech at the UN. He has made it very clear that he believes the Iranian government is a rogue regime, that we're not going to honor the nuclear agreement that was signed under the Obama administration. So where do you think we go from here? I mean, he's made it very clear to Iran that we're not going to honor an agreement that they felt was important for the future of U.S.-Iranian relations. How do you think things are going to move forward, if at all?
Well, when you compare the situation with Korea and the situation in Iran, you're reminded of the old quip, they're almost the same except they're completely different. And on the one hand, what you have is two nations that are very much antithetical to the United States at every level, philosophically down to the commercial, economic ties. And yet China, who is increasingly approaching the United States in every way, has maintained good relationship with both of them. I think in recent years, trade with Iran has amounted to some $50 billion with the United States, and yet they've recently signed or had negotiations where they've agreed to increase that to up to $600 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. So increasingly, Iran is going to be a major trading partner, and that's a similarity. Another similarity comes from the fact that China and Iran have had relationships for thousands of years. These are two very old civilizations, the Persians and the Chinese, and this dates back millennia. Now, in the 1950s, China had some very active relationship with Iran under the Shah, and that relationship survived the Cultural Revolution, and now they are very actively engaged in a variety of commercial and sociological things.
Not only on the oil, but they built the subway system in Tehran. And the Iranians view the Chinese as a constructive trading partner to building infrastructure development, improving the quality of life for the people in their country after the war.
Right. In recent years, the trade with Iran has amounted to almost 10% of the total Chinese trade. Now, 80% of that is probably oil. And this has all increased, particularly since the 1979 embargo has been lifted. However, the Chinese relationship with Iran goes way back. They're like the first step on the Belt Road, and they helped like some other countries. They helped get Iran established in their uranium development processing, and although theoretically they have stopped that, I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some sort of under-the-table business still going on. They had developed a lot of relationships with the Iranians, and it's hard to see those stop.
Well, and I think it'll be very interesting as China pursues the One Belt, One Road initiative, the Silk Road initiative, as a way to unify countries like Iran along the old Silk Road by promoting trade and economic development. Will that reduce the tensions that currently exist between Iran and the U.S. and move the people away from supporting a government that really believes that nuclear weapons are the key to their legitimacy and their success?
Well, I think the main thing it's going to do is create a greater problem for China. Again, Iran is the first stop on the One Belt, One Road initiative, and they envision greater trading in the future. I don't see major improvements in the relationship with Iran in the near future, but China does have that possibility. Now, the difference is that China really gets something out of the deal from Iran, whereas the primary beneficiary of trade between Korea and China is probably the Koreans, who are dependent upon Chinese energy. Right. And although you could say that China borders on North Korea geographically, boy, they border on Iran economically much more. With the energy interchanges and the various economic ties, I think that Iran is a much more strategically important. Now, having said that, whereas China wants this no war, no chaos, no nukes with their neighbor, I think their goal is to basically keep things as they are on the Korean Peninsula. I think their goal in Tehran is try to increase their involvement with the Iranians, and if they can bring about greater relations with the United States, I think they'll try to do that. But they've got a much better incentive to work towards improving relationships between the United States and Iran than they do with Korea.
Well, and I think as Trump is a former businessman, he knows one of the ways that he could bring China closer to the U.S. is by giving them access to oil contracts in the U.S., coal contracts that could certainly satisfy the base in West Virginia, where there's been a big push by certain elements to stop them from producing coal. But it would be a way to move China away from relying on Iran for the oil and North Korea for the coal. I mean, that would be a very interesting move on his part. And that way China would not have to rely on countries that are really adverse to the U.S. and could focus on trade and economic development, at the same time promote order and stability in the region.
I think so. At the end of the day, both of these two rogue nations, as Trump would look at them, are very much at odds with the United States, and yet they're very close. They have very close ties to China. As the relationship between China and the United States grows and grows, which I feel that it will, we have to figure out exactly what do we do with our relationship with China, and that's not going to be an easy question. I think one thing about the Chinese, however, is that they tend to be, say, less than the old Soviet Union. They tend to be more pragmatic. They tend to look at their international relations as a way of establishing good friendships with other countries.
Transactional. They don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. They're focused on trade and business development ties.
Exactly. Transactional rather than ideological. And I think that if you had a change of regime, for example, in North Korea, I think the Chinese would feel very threatened by that.
Sure. Politically and maybe on the business side as well.
Right. And if you had a change of regime in Iran, I don't think it would impact them. Again, their relationship began with the Shah back in the 50s, their close relationship, and has continued despite the changes in politics. I think if suddenly the Iranian regime changed, I think the United States and China would both be happier. I'm not sure that's going to happen in the near future. So the trick is going to rely upon the Chinese to walk a very careful line between their growing business connections with Iran and their growing business connections with the United States. I think it's safe to say that their ties to the United States are more important to them. We're a bigger trading partner. However,
it's harder for them to get in here to do business than it is to go into Iran, and that's a point that I've always tried to stress. You know, make it easier for Chinese companies to come into the U.S. to promote trade and economic development, and that way they won't have to go and engage with what countries we consider rogue, like North Korea and Iran. The other interesting aspect that I think, as you and I being both former wrestlers, the intersection of sports diplomacy and stability and peace development. We have seen, while America has bad relations with Iran on the political level, on the sports side, the U.S. team is well renowned in Iran. I mean, as you know, when the U.S. team goes to Iran, they are treated like VIPs. They move to the front of the line to go through customs, except they don't go through customs right away because everyone wants to take their picture. And they're treated as rock stars in the country. They have a meeting with the head of the Iranian government. How do you think we can take those ties and move it up to a level where we can have constructive dialogue? Because China indirectly does that as well with their sportsmen. But they place sports as a very high premium as well. And I think the U.S. could do a much better job of really utilizing the sports angle in our dealings with both North Korea and Iran, and complementing what China is doing in that regard.
Sure. Nelson Mandela once said, sport has the power to change the world. And the Soviets realized that in 1952 when they returned to the Olympics for the first time, and it became a propaganda vehicle. It still is in some ways to a lot of countries. 20 years ago, China was insignificant on the world sports scene, and yet when they decided that they were going to try to re-enter the world community as a major power, they concluded that participating in sports was a critical part of that. They hosted what, in the minds of many, was one of the best Olympic Games ever. And having done that, I think they've sort of turned around their image, but can use sport diplomacy. I mean, the classic example of sports diplomacy, obviously, is when Henry Kissinger did the ping pong diplomacy and showed that you can open up China. If you could do that with the Iranians, that would be a fantastic operation. In fact, I think, you know, if Trump could set up an international sporting event with Russia, China, Iran, and the United States, I think that would do a lot to
Oh, yeah.
for all of these different
Yeah, and as we've
relationships.
seen through the sport of wrestling, it is possible to bring those countries together. Even trying to get the sport back into the Olympics, you had Russia, Iran, U.S., Cuba all working together.
Sure.
And North Korea.
Sure. Well, there was a time when the major sport in China used to be ping pong, but if you look at the results of the Olympic Games last time, they were scoring medals across the board, and probably their total medal count in terms of gold medals, I think, was #1. It depends on how you count it. The United States had more of one kind, the Chinese, but at least one way of measuring the Chinese were the victors in those games. So whether it's a sport like ping pong or table tennis or something else, who knows? With Iran, obviously wrestling would be the thing. As you mentioned, you could walk through the streets of Tehran and ask people to name 3 American wrestlers on the U.S. national freestyle team, and I would say 90% of them can do it. You can't walk through the streets of Washington, D.C. and get people to name 3 people who are on the wrestling team. So if you could figure out the right sport and do what Mandela did. Remember, Mandela brought his country together by telling the black population that we are one country, one nation, one sport, and that led to a phenomenal change. Hopefully we can do that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, and we've enjoyed our time here on Windows of the World, and we look forward to coming back at a later date. Thank you very much.